In the annals of human depravity, few names evoke such visceral horror as Caligula, the Roman emperor who transformed the mightiest empire on earth into his personal playground of death, debauchery, and divine delusion. What you're about to witness is not merely the story of a mad ruler, but a chilling examination of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, turning a promising young man into a monster whose cruelty would make even the most hardened executioner weep. This is the forbidden history that Rome tried desperately to erase, a tale so dark that ancient historians whispered it in shadows, fearing that even speaking his name might summon his ghost back to terrorize the living. The year was 37 AD when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, ascended to the throne of Rome at just 24 years old. The empire that had conquered the known world, built upon the disciplined legions and calculated brutality of its predecessors, was about to witness 4 years of madness that would redefine the very concept of tyranny. What began as the hopeful reign of a beloved prince would spiral into an orgy of violence so extreme that it shocked even a civilization accustomed to crucifixions and gladiatorial combat. The sources for this dark chronicle come from the most respected historians of antiquity, Suetonius, whose Lives of the 12 Caesars provides intimate and horrifying details of Caligula's excesses, Tacitus, the master chronicler whose accounts of imperial corruption remain unmatched, and Cassius Dio, whose Roman history preserves testimonies from those who witnessed the madness firsthand. These men risked their lives to document what they saw, knowing that future generations needed to understand how quickly civilization could crumble under the weight of unchecked power. To understand the depths of Caligula's depravity, we must first examine the corrupted soil from which this poisonous flower bloomed. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, young Gaius was raised in a world where murder was politics and politics was survival. His great-grandfather was Augustus, the first Roman emperor who had established the Principate through calculated violence and political genius. His grandfather Tiberius ruled through fear and paranoia, while his father Germanicus was beloved by the legion, a popularity that may have cost him his life through poison. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boot, came from his childhood spent among his father's legions on the Germanic frontier. Soldiers adored the young boy who wore miniature military gear and marched alongside battle-hardened veterans. This early exposure to military life and the casual brutality of Roman warfare would later manifest in his obsession with gladiatorial games and public executions. The innocent child who once charmed hardened soldiers would grow into a man who found genuine pleasure in watching others suffer. His path to power was paved with the bodies of his family members. Tiberius, growing increasingly paranoid in his final years, systematically eliminated potential rivals to his throne. Caligula's mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled and starved to death, while his brothers Nero and Drusus were imprisoned and killed. Only Caligula's apparent harmlessness, his youth and his reputation as a theatrical dilettante saved him from joining his family in death. Tiberius famously remarked that he was nursing a viper for the Roman people, a prophecy that would prove horrifyingly accurate. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, possibly smothered by Caligula himself according to some accounts, the young prince inherited an empire that controlled territory from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. The Roman Senate, exhausted by Tiberius's reign of terror, welcomed Caligula with genuine enthusiasm. They had no way of knowing that they were trading one monster for another, one whose appetite for cruelty would make his predecessor look like a benevolent grandfather. Caligula's early months as emperor seemed to herald a golden age for Rome. The young ruler distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the urban cohorts, and the fire brigades, buying their loyalty with the blood money of his predecessors. He recalled political exiles, released prisoners, and published the imperial budget for public scrutiny, gestures that won him tremendous popularity among both the elite and common citizens. The Roman people, starved for hope after years of Tiberius's grim rule, embraced their charismatic young emperor with an enthusiasm bordering on worship. He organized spectacular gladiatorial games and chariot races, spending lavishly on public entertainment that dazzled the masses. The amphitheaters ran red with blood as exotic animals from across the empire were slaughtered for the crowd's amusement, while the finest gladiators fought to the death in contests that lasted from dawn to dusk. Caligula himself presided over these spectacles with apparent joy, his laughter echoing through the arena as men died for his entertainment. What the crowd interpreted as generous patronage was actually the first glimpse of his pathological relationship with violence and death. During this honeymoon period, Caligula also completed several of Tiberius's unfinished construction projects and initiated new public works that employed thousands of citizens. He restored the theater of Pompey and built a new amphitheater, monuments to Roman engineering that masked the growing darkness in his soul. Foreign ambassadors reported that the young emperor seemed intelligent and well-spoken, handling diplomatic matters with surprising competence for someone so young and inexperienced. However, even during these early months, careful observers noted disturbing signs. Caligula's laughter during the gladiatorial games was too loud, too genuine, lasting too long after the crowds had grown silent. His eyes would follow the blood as it pooled in the arena sand, and palace servants whispered that he would sometimes sneak back to the empty amphitheater at night, walking alone through the corridors where men had died hours before. The seeds of madness were already germinating, watered by the intoxicating wine of absolute power. 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill, with a mysterious condition that would mark the transformation from promising young emperor to the monster history remembers. Ancient sources describe symptoms that modern medical experts have theorized could represent anything from encephalitis to temporal lobe epilepsy. But the exact nature of his illness remains one of history's most debated mysteries. What is certain is that the man who emerged from his sickbed was fundamentally changed, as if the fever had burned away whatever humanity remained in his soul. Suetonius records that during his illness, the Roman people were so concerned for their beloved emperor that they held vigils outside the palace, with some citizens even vowing to sacrifice their own lives to the gods if Caligula recovered. The irony of these prayers would become apparent only later, when those same citizens would pray just as fervently for his death. The gods, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. They granted the first prayer while ensuring the second would become necessary. When Caligula finally recovered, palace insiders immediately noticed changes in his behavior. His voice had developed a harsh, grating quality that made listeners uncomfortable, and his eyes had acquired an unsettling intensity that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He began experiencing what he described as conversations with the gods, claiming that Jupiter spoke to him directly and that he could see divine visions invisible to mortal eyes. These supposed divine communications would later justify his most extreme acts of cruelty and self-deification. The illness also seemed to awaken in Caligula an insatiable appetite for cruelty that went far beyond the casual violence expected of Roman rulers. Before his sickness, he had shown typical aristocratic indifference to suffering. Afterward, he actively sought opportunities to cause pain and humiliation. He would spend hours devising elaborate punishments for perceived slights, delighting in the creativity of his tortures as much as their execution. The transformation was so complete that some historians have suggested the illness might have been a form of brain damage that destroyed his capacity for empathy while leaving his intelligence intact. The first clear sign of Caligula's mental deterioration came through his increasingly erratic behavior toward those closest to him. He forced his beloved sister Drusilla to divorce her husband and live with him as his wife, openly engaging in incestuous relations that scandalized even the morally flexible Roman aristocracy. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, Caligula declared her a goddess and made denial of her divinity a capital offense. He spent months in mourning, during which it became a crime to laugh, bathe, or dine with one's family, violations punishable by death. His paranoia began manifesting in deadly ways as he started seeing conspiracies everywhere. Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected senator and potential rival, was forced to commit suicide based on nothing more than Caligula's suspicion. The emperor claimed that Silanus had appeared threatening in a dream, making his death a matter of prophetic necessity. This established a terrifying precedent. Anyone who appeared in Caligula's nightmares might find themselves receiving a visit from the Praetorian Guard the following morning. Caligula's relationship with the Roman Senate deteriorated rapidly as his megalomania grew. He began appearing before them dressed as various gods, sometimes Jupiter with a false beard and thunderbolt, other times as Neptune with a trident, occasionally as Venus in women's clothing and cosmetics. He demanded that senators approach him on their hands and knees, kissing his feet before being allowed to speak. Those who showed even the slightest hesitation were marked for execution, their property confiscated to fund his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. The emperor's mood swings became legendary for their unpredictability and violence. He might begin a dinner party in jovial spirits, regaling guests with witty conversation and elaborate entertainments, only to suddenly order the execution of a random attendee for an imagined slight. Dinner guests learned to smile and laugh at his jokes while mentally preparing for the possibility that they might not survive the evening. The palace became a theater of terror where the wrong facial expression could mean death, and silence was as dangerous as speech. His delusions of grandeur reached new heights when he began claiming direct descent from Jupiter and demanding worship as a living god. He had statues of himself erected in temples throughout the empire, replacing the heads of traditional deities with his own likeness. Citizens were required to offer sacrifices to his image, and failure to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm in worship could result in immediate execution. The line between emperor and deity had been completely erased in his fevered mind. As Caligula's madness deepened, his court became a carnival of sexual excess and ritualized violence that shocked even a society accustomed to decadence. He instituted regular orgies that combined sexual debauchery with acts of extreme cruelty, forcing senators and their wives to participate while he watched from a throne-like chair, deciding who would live and who would die based on their performance. These gatherings were not merely about pleasure. They were elaborate displays of power, where human dignity was systematically destroyed for his entertainment. The emperor's sexual depravity knew no bounds or social distinctions. He would summon married women to his palace and rape them in front of their husbands, rating their performance publicly and comparing their bodies to those of famous courtesans. Suetonius records that he would invite couples to dinner, examine the wives with the clinical detachment of a slave trader, then force the husbands to watch as he violated their spouses. Upon returning to the dining room, he would provide detailed commentary on each woman's sexual performance, forcing their humiliated husbands to nod and smile in agreement or face execution. His sexual appetites extended far beyond conventional adultery, into realms that horrified even his most debauched courtiers. He maintained a stable of male and female prostitutes for his pleasure, but also engaged in systematic sexual abuse of both male and female members of the aristocracy. Young senators were forced to serve as his sexual playthings, while their wives and daughters were treated as imperial property to be used at will. The palace became a brothel where Roman nobility were reduced to the status of sexual slaves. The emperor's relationship with his sisters transcended even the flexible moral boundaries of Roman aristocracy. Beyond his notorious affair with Drusilla, whom he treated as his wife, historical sources suggest he engaged in sexual relationships with his other sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. He would openly fondle them at public banquets and later use them as sexual rewards for his favorites, forcing them to prostitute themselves to foreign ambassadors and wealthy Romans as demonstrations of his absolute power over the imperial family. Caligula's banquets became legendary theaters of sexual humiliation, where the boundaries between dinner party and orgy dissolved completely. Guests were required to participate in increasingly degrading acts while dining, with sexual performance becoming a literal matter of life and death. He would force elderly senators to strip naked and perform sexual acts with young slaves while the other diners continued eating, making voyeurism and participation equally mandatory for survival. The emperor developed elaborate sexual rituals that combined religious ceremony with perversion. He claimed that his sexual acts were sacred rites required by the gods, forcing participants to treat rape and abuse as religious obligations. Women were required to worship his phallus as a sacred object, while men were forced to perform oral sex on him as a form of imperial communion. These blasphemous ceremonies turned sexual violence into twisted religious practice. His treatment of children was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of his sexual depravity. Ancient sources record that he violated the young daughters of senators and equestrians, some barely past childhood, then forced their parents to watch and express gratitude for the honor their families had received. The innocence of children became another boundary for him to cross in his systematic destruction of every moral constraint that civilized society had established. The emperor's sexual sadism extended to elaborate punishments designed to maximize humiliation and psychological torture. He would force condemned men to watch their wives and daughters being sexually abused before their execution, making rape a prelude to murder. Women who displeased him were not simply killed, but first subjected to systematic sexual torture, their screams echoing through the palace corridors as a warning to others who might defy his will. The gladiatorial games under Caligula reached new levels of sadistic creativity that combined sexual violence with public spectacle. He would force aristocrats to fight naked in the arena while being sexually assaulted by specially trained gladiators, turning combat into a form of public rape. When the supply of condemned criminals ran low, he would order sections of the crowd to be violated before being thrown to the lions, making sexual abuse a prelude to death. The amphitheater, once a symbol of Roman engineering prowess, became a theater of sexual violence where citizens could be raped and murdered for the emperor's entertainment. Caligula's reign of terror was funded by the systematic looting of the Roman treasury and the wealth of its citizens. Within the first year of his rule, he had squandered the massive surplus left by the frugal Tiberius, an estimated 7 billion sesterces, on games, banquets, and grandiose construction projects designed to glorify his divine status. When the money ran out, he turned to increasingly desperate and violent methods of fundraising that pushed the empire toward economic collapse. His solution was to revive the treason trials that had terrorized Rome during Tiberius's reign, but with a crucial difference. Where Tiberius had used them primarily for political control, Caligula used them purely for profit. Wealthy citizens found themselves accused of imaginary crimes against the emperor's divine person, their property confiscated before they were executed or forced into exile. The mere possession of wealth became a capital offense in Caligula's Rome, as the emperor viewed every rich citizen as a potential source of funding for his excesses. The emperor instituted a series of bizarre taxes that revealed both his financial desperation and his complete detachment from reality. He taxed lawsuits, marriages, and divorces, then expanded to tax prostitution, gambling, and even the privilege of remaining silent during his speeches. Citizens were required to pay for the honor of being allowed to breathe in his presence, and failure to pay these absurd levies was treated as treason. The Roman economy, built on centuries of conquest and trade, was being cannibalized to feed one man's insatiable appetite for luxury and cruelty. Perhaps most revealing of his madness was Caligula's decision to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul, the highest civilian office in the Roman government. The horse lived in a marble stable with an ivory manger, wore purple blankets, and had a dedicated staff of servants. While this might seem like mere eccentricity, it represented a deliberate humiliation of the Senate and the entire Roman political system. By elevating an animal to the highest human office, Caligula was announcing that he considered Roman senators to be lower than beasts. His megalomania manifested in construction projects that defied both logic and engineering possibility. He began building a bridge across the Bay of Naples, a distance of over 3 miles, simply so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, claiming to surpass the legendary conqueror who had merely walked across the Hellespont. The bridge consumed enormous resources and hundreds of lives during its construction, only to be abandoned when Caligula lost interest in the project. Similar follies dotted the empire as the emperor's whims consumed the wealth of nations. The imperial palace during Caligula's reign became a maze of terror where courtiers navigated daily between life and death based on the emperor's shifting moods. Every corridor held the potential for sudden violence, and every conversation might be the last words a person ever spoke. The palace staff developed an elaborate system of signals and codes to warn each other of the emperor's mental state. But even these precautions often failed when his rage struck without warning. Caligula's private apartments were furnished with instruments of torture alongside priceless works of art, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that reflected his twisted psyche. Visitors reported seeing iron maidens next to marble statues of Venus, while racks and thumbscrews were displayed like precious ornaments in rooms decorated with silk tapestries and gold leaf. The emperor took personal pleasure in explaining the function of each device to his guests, often providing detailed descriptions of how they had been used on previous victims. The emperor's daily routine became a performance of calculated cruelty, designed to keep everyone around him in a constant state of terror. He would hold morning audiences where he might grant a petitioner's request or order their immediate execution based on purely arbitrary criteria: the color of their toga, the sound of their voice, or simply because their face annoyed him that particular day. These audiences became gladiatorial contests of survival, where Roman citizens competed for the prize of being allowed to continue living. His sleeping quarters were equipped with multiple beds because he claimed that different gods visited him in dreams and required different accommodations. Palace guards reported hearing him having conversations with invisible entities throughout the night, sometimes laughing hysterically, other times screaming in apparent terror. When morning came, his nocturnal divine consultations often resulted in death sentences for people who had appeared in his dreams, making sleep itself a weapon in his arsenal of terror. The imperial kitchen became another venue for his sadistic creativity. Caligula would force his guests to eat dishes made from human flesh, claiming it was a delicacy enjoyed by the gods. Whether the meat was actually human or merely presented as such is debated by historians, but the psychological impact was identical, reducing proud Roman citizens to cannibals through a combination of fear and carefully orchestrated humiliation. The dining hall, once a place of civilized discourse, became a chamber of horrors where any meal might be your last. Caligula's relationship with the Roman military revealed the depths of his delusion and the extent to which absolute power had corrupted his judgment. Despite having no significant military experience, he declared himself the greatest general in Roman history and embarked on campaigns that were more theater than warfare. His expedition to Germany in 39 AD was characterized by bizarre behavior that alarmed even his most loyal officers. He ordered his legions to collect seashells on the beaches of Gaul, declaring them spoils of war from the conquered ocean, and sending them back to Rome as trophies of his victory over Neptune. The soldiers, hardened veterans of real campaigns, were forced to participate in this absurd charade, while their emperor proclaimed himself the conqueror of seas and heavens. The psychological impact on the legions was devastating. They had sworn oaths to follow a commander who was clearly insane, yet desertion meant death for them and their families. His treatment of military officers reflected his growing paranoia and need to humiliate those who might pose a threat to his power. He forced centurions to strip naked and crawl through mud while he watched from his litter, laughing at their degradation. Senior officers were required to run alongside his chariot for miles, and those who showed signs of exhaustion were executed for insufficient devotion to their emperor. The Roman military, built on discipline and mutual respect between commanders and soldiers, was being systematically destroyed by one man's madness. The emperor's obsession with his divine status extended to his military commands, where he would claim to receive battle orders directly from the gods. He would halt entire armies to commune with invisible deities, forcing thousands of soldiers to wait in formation while he held conversations with the empty air. These episodes could last for hours, during which any soldier who showed skepticism or impatience would be marked for punishment. The logistics of maintaining an army ground to a halt when the commanding officer was more concerned with his divine hallucinations than military strategy. Perhaps most revealing of his military incompetence was his planned invasion of Britain, which he abandoned at the last moment when he claimed that Neptune had warned him against crossing the English Channel. Instead of admitting failure, he declared victory over the British without ever setting foot on their shores, then returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph based on entirely fictional conquests. The Roman people, desperate to believe in their emperor's competence, participated in the celebration even though many suspected the truth. By 41 AD, Caligula's reign of terror had pushed even his closest supporters to the breaking point. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal protectors of the imperial family, had become instruments of his cruelty, forced to carry out increasingly bizarre and violent orders that violated every principle of Roman honor and military discipline. The officers who had sworn to protect the emperor with their lives began to see him as a greater threat to Rome than any foreign enemy. Cassius Dio, a senior centurion of the Praetorian Guard, emerged as the leader of the conspiracy against Caligula. Dio had been repeatedly humiliated by the emperor, who mocked his high-pitched voice and forced him to use passwords like Priapus and Venus that were designed to embarrass a career soldier. The personal humiliation, combined with his growing horror at Caligula's crimes, made Dio determined to rid Rome of its mad emperor before the empire collapsed entirely. The conspiracy included senators, equestrians, and freedmen who had all suffered under Caligula's arbitrary rule. What united these diverse plotters was not political ideology, but simple survival. They recognized that as long as Caligula lived, no one in Rome was safe from his paranoid delusions and sadistic whims. The conspiracy was remarkable for its broad support across all social classes, suggesting that Caligula had managed to unite the entire city against him through the sheer extremity of his cruelty. The final straw came during the Palatine Games in January 41 AD, when Caligula announced his intention to move permanently to Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a living god without the constraints of Roman tradition. He also revealed plans to massacre the entire Senate and replace them with his horse and other favorites, effectively ending the Roman Republic forever. The conspirators realized that they had to act immediately or watch their civilization disappear into the abyss of one man's madness. The plot was carefully timed for the changing of the guard, when the palace would be most vulnerable. The conspirators had studied Caligula's daily routine and identified the narrow corridor beneath the palace, where he would be most isolated from his loyal Germanic bodyguards. Every detail was planned with military precision, reflecting the professional competence of the Praetorian officers who had finally decided that their oath to Rome superseded their oath to the emperor. On January 24th, 41 AD, Caligula attended the final day of the Palatine Games, watching theatrical performances that ironically included scenes of assassination and political violence. The emperor seemed to enjoy the fictional murders on stage, unaware that his own death was being planned in the shadows around him. As the day wore on, his Germanic bodyguards noticed unusual activity among the Praetorian officers, but their warnings went unheeded by an emperor who had become convinced of his own invincibility. When Caligula left the theater to return to his palace for lunch, he chose to take a shortcut through the narrow underground passage that the conspirators had identified as their killing ground. Cassius Dio and his fellow plotters were waiting in the shadows, their swords drawn and their resolve hardened by years of witnessing atrocities. The moment the emperor entered the corridor, separated from his loyal guards, the conspirators struck with the fury of men who had seen too much evil. The assassination was swift and brutal. Dio struck the first blow, cutting deep into Caligula's jaw and neck, while other conspirators stabbed repeatedly until the emperor collapsed in a pool of his own blood. According to Suetonius, Caligula died with 30 wounds on his body, each one representing the accumulated rage of those who had suffered under his reign. His final words were reportedly, "I am still alive," a desperate assertion of the immortality he had claimed as a god, now proven false by the reality of his mortality. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the extent to which fear had paralyzed the Roman government. The Senate, rather than celebrating their liberation, initially panicked at the news of Caligula's death, terrified that his Germanic guards would massacre them in revenge. The Praetorian Guard themselves were divided between those who had participated in the conspiracy and those who remained loyal to the imperial family. For several hours, the fate of the empire hung in the balance as various factions tried to determine who would rule Rome. The conspirators had planned the assassination, but failed to prepare for the succession, an oversight that nearly plunged Rome into civil war. The discovery of Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace provided an unexpected solution. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor, more out of desperation than conviction. The choice proved fortunate for Rome, as Claudius would restore stability and competent governance to an empire that had nearly been destroyed by 4 years of madness. The reign of terror was over, but the scars it left on Roman society would take decades to heal. The assassination of Caligula marked the end of one of history's most psychologically disturbing reigns, but the impact of his 4 years of terror extended far beyond his death. The Roman Empire had been fundamentally changed by the experience of absolute tyranny, and the institutions that had once seemed unshakable were revealed to be as fragile as the sanity of the man who ruled them. The conspiracy that killed him demonstrated both the resilience of human dignity in the face of extreme oppression and the ultimate fragility of unchecked power. Ancient historians struggled to comprehend how a civilization as sophisticated as Rome could have produced and tolerated such a monster. Suetonius, writing decades after Caligula's death, still seemed incredulous at the extremity of the emperor's cruelty, while Tacitus used the reign as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. These writers understood that Caligula was not merely an aberration, but a warning about what could happen when institutional safeguards failed and power was concentrated in the hands of a single individual. The deliberate destruction of Caligula's memory, The damnatio memoriae ordered by the Senate revealed the Romans' desperate need to erase the trauma of his reign from their collective consciousness. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were defaced, and official records were altered to minimize references to the mad emperor. Yet this very effort to forget ironically ensured that future generations would remember, as the extremity of the erasure testified to the extremity of the crimes being hidden. Modern historians have debated the exact nature of Caligula's mental illness, with theories ranging from temporal lobe epilepsy to bipolar disorder to simple psychopathy exacerbated by absolute power. What remains undisputed is that his reign demonstrated how quickly civilized society could collapse when leadership was placed in the hands of someone who combined unlimited authority with complete moral bankruptcy. The Roman Empire survived Caligula, but it was forever changed by the knowledge that such horrors were possible. The parallels between Caligula's reign and other instances of absolute tyranny throughout history are both obvious and chilling. The pattern of initial popularity, followed by increasing paranoia, the use of spectacle and violence to maintain control, the systematic destruction of institutional safeguards, and the ultimate dependence on fear rather than legitimacy, these elements would be repeated by tyrants throughout the centuries. Caligula's example serves as a reminder that the capacity for evil is not limited by time, place, or culture, but is a permanent feature of human nature that must be constrained by law, custom, and the courage of those who refuse to remain silent in the face of atrocity. The story of Caligula forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and human nature. It reminds us that civilized behavior is not the natural state of humanity, but an achievement that must be constantly maintained and defended. When we witness the systematic destruction of human dignity, when we see power wielded without restraint or accountability, when we observe the reduction of human beings to objects for the amusement of their rulers, we are seeing the same forces that transformed a promising young Roman prince into one of history's most notorious monsters. The lesson of Caligula is not just about ancient Rome. It is about the eternal vigilance required to prevent such horrors from recurring in any time or place where human beings exercise power over other human beings.